Welcome to Mindful Moments, like a protein bar for your brain.
Okay, so forget everything you think you know about the so-called Dark Ages. Because what if those 1,000 years after Rome weren't a period of stagnation, but more like a crucible? A time when the very foundations of our modern world were forged through a mix of surprising innovations and cultural blending.
Hmm, that's a great way to put it, actually. Yeah.
Well, today we're diving into that medieval millennium, the period spanning roughly from the 4th to the 14th century.
Right.
And, we're going beyond just Western Europe. We'll be looking at Byzantium, the Islamic world, and Jewish civilization as well, to really try to uncover those transformative forces that continue to echo, even today, in ways we might not even realize.
It's crucial to approach this era through a global lens.
Yeah, absolutely.
The scope is so vast. We'll be looking at religious upheavals, intellectual breakthroughs, and those really fascinating cultural exchanges that were happening across all these different societies. And, by understanding this interconnected history, we can move beyond those kind of simplistic ideas of, you know, progress versus decline
Hmm.
and really appreciate the complexity of our past and how it, shapes our present.
I'm really excited to get into this.
Me too.
Let's start with the Roman Empire. Okay, so it often feels like when we think about Rome that it all just came to this like sudden crashing end.
Right.
But I think the seeds of change were actually planted a lot earlier, weren't they, with Constantine?
Oh, absolutely. Constantine's decision to Christianize the Roman Empire back in the 4th century, well, that was more than just a personal conversion, right?
Yeah.
It really was a pivotal moment. It fundamentally reshaped the empire's entire structure, and, he basically merged religious authority with the power of the state.
Right.
And this decision really set the stage for a very Christian-centric framework that went on to shape the development of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires.
It's interesting to think about that division of the empire, right, into East and West, because it seems so crucial in understanding why their paths diverged so much.
I think so, yeah. That split, it really created these two distinct spheres of influence, culturally and politically, which ultimately led to, very different outcomes.
Right.
In the West, you see the fragmentation of imperial authority, eventually leading to the rise of various Germanic kingdoms. And the church, of course, gained considerable power in this vacuum.
Yeah.
But in the East, you have the emergence of the Byzantine Empire, which in many ways actually continued Roman traditions. It's fascinating, right?
It is. And speaking of different paths, there's this really interesting figure, Julian the Apostate, who actually tried to revive paganism.
Yeah, that was short-lived, though.
It was. Why do you think his efforts ultimately failed to take hold?
Well, you have to look at the context, right? I mean, compared to Christianity, which, had developed over centuries by this point into a very organized, unified force, paganism was, it was much more fragmented.
Right.
Julian, as smart as he was, couldn't overcome that lack of organization.
Right.
Christianity just had this, much stronger sense of community, and it offered these really compelling answers to a lot of fundamental human needs.
Yeah.
Needs that paganism, with its diverse but often kind of disorganized traditions, just couldn't match, especially once imperial favor shifted away from it.
So it wasn't just that Christianity rose, but it really interacted with and adapted elements of classical culture, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Christianity wasn't just a rejection of everything that came before. It very selectively integrated aspects of Greek philosophy, Roman law, and even classical literature, reinterpreting them within this new Christian theological framework.
It's fascinating to see how that worked.
Right. I mean, just think about the way classical rhetoric was adapted for use in sermons, or how Aristotelian concepts ended up being used to try to explain Christian doctrines. It was a really dynamic process, this back and forth of assimilation and transformation.
So eventually, of course, the Western Roman Empire crumbles. And in the midst of all that instability, the church, its authority really starts to grow significantly, doesn't it?
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
As the West kind of falls apart politically, the church is there with its established hierarchy and its, pretty powerful moral authority, and it kind of steps into the void.
Yeah.
Bishops start taking on bigger roles in local administration, and the church really becomes this, this force for order and continuity in a world that feels very, very fragmented.
Meanwhile, over in the East, the Byzantine Empire is is kind of doing its own thing, still holding on to some of those Roman traditions. And when I think about Byzantium, one figure that always comes to mind is Justinian.
Yeah, Justinian's reign in the 6th century really was kind of the high point for the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah.
He was a fascinating character. His legal reforms, the Corpus Juris Civilis, they were huge.
Right.
It provided this really solid legal framework that ended up influencing jurisprudence across Europe for centuries. And, you can't forget his architectural achievements like the Hagia Sophia, just incredible.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the consolidation of Orthodox Christianity as the state religion. These are all key things that really defined Byzantine identity.
Right.
They saw themselves as Romans, the inheritors of Rome, but they also developed this really unique blend of, that Roman heritage with the Greek language and the Orthodox faith.
It's really interesting to see how that all came together. Okay, so let's shift our focus eastward now to the rise of Islam in the 7th century.
Yeah.
This is another period of just immense change.
It's hard to overstate the impact of Islam. I mean, you have the Prophet Muhammad, this new faith, and then its incredibly rapid expansion across vast territories. This was a turning point in world history. And, it wasn't just a political or military phenomenon, though. It also gave birth to this extraordinary period of intellectual and cultural flourishing that we often call the Islamic Golden Age.
The Islamic Golden Age. I think that's something that's often overlooked in traditional kind of Eurocentric narratives of the Middle Ages, but it really was a major hub of innovation.
Oh, absolutely. One of the really remarkable things about the Islamic world is how they preserved and built upon and ultimately really, really advanced the intellectual heritage they received from the Greeks.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Under the Umayyad and the Baisid Caliphates, you have this incredible emphasis on translating and studying classical texts, and that led to some groundbreaking contributions. I mean, in mathematics, they developed algebra, right?
Right.
And in astronomy, medicine, philosophy, these are really fertile times.
Yeah.
And figures like Avicenna and Averroes, their influence stretched far beyond the Islamic world. I mean, their ideas would later have a significant impact in Europe as well.
And then, of course, you have Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, this really vibrant center of cultural exchange.
Yeah, Al-Andalus became this kind of incredible meeting point where, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars all came together. You had this really rich exchange of knowledge, ideas, and technologies happening. And that cross-pollination, it played a huge role in the eventual intellectual reawakening that would happen in Europe.
And speaking of Jewish communities, I think their experience navigating all these different empires, all these different rulers, it offers a really fascinating perspective.
Oh, it does. For Jewish communities in the medieval period, life was, it could be really unpredictable.
Yeah.
They lived under both Christian and Muslim rule, and their experiences vary widely. Sometimes there were periods of relative tolerance, but then other times there was intense persecution. But despite all that, despite the challenges, Jewish intellectual and cultural life really flourished.
It did.
You have the development of the Talmud during this time. The Talmud provided this, central framework for Jewish law, ethics, and communal identity. It really helped hold things together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also see some very influential Jewish philosophical thinkers emerge, like Maimonides.
Maimonides is a great example.
Yeah.
He was trying to do something similar to what some of his Christian contemporaries were doing. He was trying to harmonize Aristotelian philosophy with Jewish theological principles. And his work, it had a profound impact on both Jewish and Christian thought, which I think really highlights how interconnected these intellectual pursuits were, even across religious divides.
That's amazing. And, if you're interested in hearing how AI is now being used to analyze historical texts, including, things like Maimonides' writings, there's this great YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. You should check it out. They offer some really insightful AI-driven audiobook analyses.
Oh, I'll have to check that out.
But let's go back to Western Europe for a minute. Earlier we were talking about the fall of Rome and how that often leads to this label, the Dark Ages. But was that label really accurate?
Well, like most labels, it's an oversimplification, right?
Okay.
I mean, sure, the immediate aftermath of the Western Roman Empire's collapse, there was a lot of instability, and some areas definitely experienced decline.
Yeah.
But it was also a period of significant adaptation. People had to figure out new ways of living, new ways of organizing themselves. And you actually see some real innovation happening during this time, the laying of new societal foundations.
Right.
The Germanic kingdoms, even though they were initially very decentralized, they gradually developed their own distinct legal and political system.
And, something that we can't overlook is the role of monasticism. Those communities were really vital in preserving knowledge and providing stability during all this upheaval, weren't they?
Totally. I mean, monasteries really were these beacons of learning. The monks meticulously copied and preserved all those classical texts, safeguarding that intellectual heritage that could have been lost.
Oh.
And, they did a lot more than just copy books. They contributed to agricultural advancements, provided social support, and really helped spread Christianity. In many areas, monastic communities were the primary centers of literacy and organized life.
Then, of course, you have Charlemagne and the Carolingian Renaissance. This was a period of kind of renewed intellectual ambition, wasn't it?
Exactly. Charlemagne, who reigned in the late 8th and early 9th centuries, he really made a deliberate effort to revive learning and culture. He was looking back to the Roman past for inspiration, and he supported, the establishment of schools, the standardization of writing, the Carolingian minuscule, and all those beautiful manuscripts.
Right.
Now, the impact of the Carolingian Renaissance was, somewhat limited in the long run.
Right.
But it laid some essential groundwork for the intellectual growth that would happen later.
And then, just as things seem to be stabilizing a bit, you have the Viking invasions. How did Europe cope with this new wave of instability?
Well, the Viking incursions, which started in the 9th century and went on for a couple of hundred years, they created widespread insecurity.
Right.
And Europe had to adapt. It had to find new ways to defend itself, new ways to organize itself. And, one of the key developments that emerged from this period was feudalism.
Feudalism?
Yeah, this very decentralized system of kind of reciprocal obligations between lords and vassals.
Right.
Part of the reason feudalism took hold was that it offered a way to provide local defense and, maintain some semblance of order in the absence of a strong central authority.
Okay, so you have all this instability, all this disruption, but then by the High Middle Ages, things start to shift again.
Yeah, things get really interesting.
We see this period of pretty remarkable economic expansion.
Exactly. Starting around the 11th century, Western Europe experiences this really significant economic resurgence. You have population growth, agricultural innovations like the heavy plow and the three-field system, and of course the expansion of towns and trade networks. All these things combine to create a much more dynamic and prosperous society.
And it's also during this time that we see the Crusades. We often think about the Crusades in purely religious terms, but they had a lot of other kind of broader consequences, didn't they?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, religious fervor was definitely a driving force behind the Crusades, but their impact was complex and really far-reaching.
Yeah.
They brought Western Europe into much closer contact with both the Byzantine and Islamic worlds.
Right.
And that led to a lot of cultural exchange, the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. They also contributed to the development of a sense of European identity. And, they had some pretty major political and economic ramifications that played out over centuries.
Okay, and what about the church? I mean, their power continues to evolve during this time, right? And that leads to some pretty intense conflict with secular rulers.
Yeah, the whole relationship between the papacy and secular rulers, that was this constant source of tension throughout the Middle Ages.
It really was.
The church, they believed in their spiritual authority, and they were not afraid to use it to try to influence political affairs.
Right.
And that led to, it led to a lot of conflict, big debates and power struggles over issues like, who had the right to appoint bishops, things like that. This struggle between spiritual and temporal power, it really shapes the political landscape of medieval Europe.
It's amazing to think about how much influence they had. And, while we're talking about these big shifts and changes, we also can't overlook all the technological advancements that were happening during this period.
That's true. I mean, the Middle Ages, they weren't technologically stagnant at all. Things like, the watermill, the windmill, improvements in agricultural implements and advancements in navigation, all of these things had a transformative effect on medieval society.
Yeah.
They helped to drive economic growth, and they really changed how people lived their everyday lives.
Okay, so let's turn our attention now to the medieval mind and spirit, so to speak. When we think about intellectual life during this period, one of the most pivotal developments is the rise of universities.
Yeah, the emergence of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, that was a major turning point.
Yeah.
It really was. For the first time, you have these institutions dedicated to the systematic pursuit of knowledge.
Wow.
And they attracted scholars and students from, all across Europe. They became these centers of intellectual debate and they were really crucial in transmitting both classical learning and new ideas.
It's incredible how quickly they spread. And around this time, you also have the rediscovery of Aristotle's writings, which had a huge impact on intellectual thought.
Oh, the rediscovery of Aristotle. That was huge. A lot of his philosophical works were reintroduced to the West, many of them through translations from Arabic, and it really sparked this kind of intellectual revolution.
It's fascinating.
His ideas about logic and natural philosophy, they challenged a lot of existing Christian doctrines.
Right.
And it led to some really intense debates.
I can imagine.
And eventually, it all culminated in this kind of synthesis of ideas, especially in the work of scholastic thinkers like Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, so that brings us to scholastic philosophy and this really complex relationship that people were trying to figure out between faith and reason.
Yeah, scholasticism, that became the dominant intellectual method of the High Middle Ages.
Right.
And it was characterized by its emphasis on logic, rigorous logical inquiry. It was all about trying to reconcile faith and reason. They were trying to figure out how these two things could coexist.
Yeah.
So you have thinkers like Peter Abelard, who were exploring, complex theological questions using this very analytical approach. And then, of course, you have Aquinas, who, he's famous for trying to create this really comprehensive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy on Christian theology.
Now, it's important to remember, too, that people were engaged in scientific inquiry during the Middle Ages. I mean, it may not have looked exactly like modern science, but it was happening.
Right. Medieval scientific thought, it was definitely very closely tied to kind of the philosophical and theological frameworks of the time.
Yeah.
They were making empirical observations, but those observations were often interpreted through the lens of, Aristotelian physics or Christian cosmology.
Right.
Experimentation, as we understand it today, that wasn't really the primary methodology, but there was this intellectual curiosity about the natural world. People wanted to understand how things worked.
And we also see this real blossoming of medieval literature during this time and the emergence of vernacular languages, right?
Oh, absolutely. The development of literature in those vernacular languages, languages like Old French, Middle English, and Italian, that was a really significant cultural shift.
It really was.
You suddenly have these epic poems, romances, all sorts of literary forms that could reach a much wider audience. It wasn't just for, the Latin-speaking clergy and scholars anymore. It was for everyone.
Right.
And that had a huge impact on, popular culture. It reflected what people were thinking and feeling, and it shaped how they saw the world.
And then, of course, you have the art and architecture of the era, Romanesque and Gothic. These really were powerful expressions of the medieval worldview, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you want to understand how people thought and felt during the Middle Ages, just look at the buildings they created.
Right.
Romanesque architecture with its solid forms, it almost feels like fortresses sometimes, and those rounded arches, it conveyed this sense of power, of stability.
Yeah.
And then you have Gothic architecture, with its soaring verticality, all that stained glass and just the incredible detail and ornamentation.
Yeah.
It reflected a more spiritual aspiration, this reaching for something transcendent. These buildings, they weren't just buildings, they were theological statements in stone and light.
They're really incredible to experience, even today.
They are.
Finally, we reach Dante Alighieri and his Divine Comedy, which, it really feels like it encapsulates so much of the medieval world's thought and culture.
Oh, yeah. Dante's Divine Comedy is this monumental work. It's a synthesis of medieval theology, philosophy, literature, and, just the values of that society.
Yeah.
He weaves all these elements together into this, incredibly powerful allegorical journey.
It's a fascinating work.
It is. And what's really interesting is that, while it's very much rooted in the medieval world, you could also see some hints of the Renaissance in it. His focus on individual experience, his use of the vernacular language, those things point forward to what's coming next.
Right. So to kind of wrap up our exploration here, it's clear that the Middle Ages were far from a stagnant or dark period.
Absolutely. I mean, what we've seen is that this was a period of immense change, of intellectual ferment, of creative energy.
Yeah.
The interplay between faith and reason, the forces of, both centralization and fragmentation, all that cultural exchange happening between civilizations. It was a dynamic period.
Yeah.
And it really laid the groundwork for so much that came after.
Yeah. And I think it also prompts us to consider how some of those same underlying tensions and those transformative processes, maybe in different forms, but how they continue to influence us today, our institutions, our beliefs, even our cultural expressions.
So, without a doubt. The more we understand the complexities of the medieval period, the more we understand the long trajectory of human history and, where we came from and why things are the way they are today.
So, to all our listeners, if you found this exploration of the medieval world intriguing, be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history. And please share this discussion with anyone who might enjoy it. And if you're really interested in learning more about this period, I'll include a link in the show notes to some great resources where you can, purchase some of the books and articles that we've been talking about.
Awesome.
But most importantly, keep thinking critically about history. Question the narratives you hear and always consider the relevance of the past to the present.
That's great advice. Keep learning.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you next time.